Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the OIG Roundtable. Got the whole team here together again for another great episode. We're working back to our discussions involving process and the SIU team and how to create, really as part of that, a strong culture of investigative excellence and high quality investigations and the culture that's involved with high quality investigations. So I got the whole team here. I'm excited to have everybody here as always. Wade McFall, retired assistant special agent in charge from our LA field office of the OIG and now a member of our SIU investigative team. Jaysen Eisengrein, the retired executive from HHS OIG and retired Western UPIC director and now our special director in charge working on a ton of process improvement and business development projects, and Matt Kachansky, Jaysen's counterpart from HHS, the Northeast UPIC director, retired, and now one of our senior managers on our SIU team. And so today we want to talk, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been spending a lot of time with our SIU clients on process improvement, policies and procedures, as well as to always work on developing and enhancing our own internal SIU policies and procedures. And the thing that comes up as a topic of conversation with our clients and internally, and discussions on training and education with our SIU team internally and externally, is always on medical record reviews and some of the important nuances involving that. And a big piece of medical record reviews is always on the ask. How do you make that ask? And is it, are you asking for hundreds of records? Are you asking for a handful of records? How are you making that ask? And so, Wade, I want to start with you because obviously when you make that ask, it comes from the investigator's perspective. An ask can be a probe sample of records. It could be a statistical sample of records. It could be a targeted sample of records, right? So a probe sample of records is a select number of records. We always say that a probe sample should be 30. The Program Integrity Manual from CMS, the PIM as it's known, both on the Medicare side and on the Medicaid side, Chapter 8 of the PIM specifically addresses statistical sampling and overpayment estimation, which is known as SSOE, and it talks about sampling. If you look at the PIM talks about a sample size of 20 to 40. And when we get to Jaysen, we're going to talk about that from a policy perspective. I always say that your sampling should be 30. And if you're doing a probe sample, it should not be a cherry pick sample. It should still be a random sampling. While it has no statistical significance for extrapolation, you at least in a random sample, while you cannot recreate a probe sample in something like Excel, you can obviously screen capture how you got that sample. And it is still random in the sense that you're letting Excel pick it. You're not picking it. Whereas targeted samples are going to be specific records for specific patients and specific points in time. But, one thing, Wade, that often comes up is in your investigations and in an SIU investigation, even at the OIG, we would interview a select set of beneficiaries for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. But it's always important to get those records, right? Regardless of whether you do a statistical sample, a probe sample, or what have you, you should always look to get the records for the beneficiaries that you've interviewed, as well as masking the records for the ones that you want. So talk to us a little about the importance of both targeted requests, right? Asking for the records for the people you've spoken to, but then also the importance of masking the records that you want versus records that you really aren't interested in reviewing.
Right. And I think to kind of give it some background, I'd go back just a little bit to more of an OIG approach where we had, if we were going to get records from a provider, we had a lot of different opportunities or different avenues we could use. If they're doing an interview, you can just ask them, I want these records for these certain beneficiaries based on the statutory authority that the OIG has. A lot of agents would carry a letter that basically said, you have to give us immediate access to these records within 24 hours. And all these different requests or types of requests are really dependent on where you are in the investigation, what you're willing to reveal to the subject as far as what you know and what you're trying to figure out. So you have just the regular ask, then you have things like civil investigative demands, OIG subpoenas, grand jury subpoenas. It all depends on, what you already know, what you're willing for the target, for lack of a better word, to know what you're looking at. And then the last one, which, most of those situations give them an opportunity to either delete files, shred records or generate records. They could generate, you know, notes from visits and things of that nature. And the last one that we would use there, which kind of eliminates all those situations, is a search warrant. You go in with the search warrant and you're going to take the records right away. But getting back to the kind of the masking, more in the SIU world, again, you have to be conscious of how you're going to ask for the records and what you're going to ask for, because it gives them an opportunity to, alter records or not give you certain records if they know where you're going with it. But as you stated, if you've interviewed somebody, that those records should always be asked, even if you're doing a probe sample or a statistically valid random sample. You can always ask for records in addition to that, and that can be kind of hold a couple different purposes. One, to kind of throw them off as to what you're looking at. Maybe there's members that you don't want them to know about that you're looking at, might kind of tip your hand as to what you're looking at. But again, just because you're doing a sample, a probe, or a statistical sample doesn't mean you can't ask for records in addition to those sampling records.
So in that same vein, right? So let's talk a little bit less about the law enforcement piece, and search warrants, because SIUs don't really have that ability.
Right.
But they can do on sites and things like that, right? We have one client that we do some on sites for, right? And the UPICs do on sites and SIUs do on sites, and so you're getting those records. But an important piece of the puzzle in record requests, outside of an on-site, is getting the provider who is submitting those records to the SIU investigator, is to be ensured that the provider is attesting to the fact that they've given you everything, right? So the attestation is an important piece of the puzzle, right? And I'll tell you, it sometimes is surprising that some plans do not have attestations when they make their record requests. So talk about a little bit about, what is an attestation, why is it important, and how does it benefit, the furtherance of an investigative case from an SIU?
Right. We would always use attestations on the MCO SIU that I work with, and in most cases, it did serve the purpose that it was supposed to. Basically, for them to say, "I've given you everything we have. I'm not going to find more records. I'm attesting to the fact that you have everything that I have." And in most cases, it not only puts them on notice that they're conferring that that's it, I can't come up with more records, but I have come across situations where I've gotten attestation from a provider, saying this is all the records we have, and I did the record review and came up with a huge overpayment, like a 90% overpayment. And it was pretty clear that they just didn't have records. This had to do with the adult daycare situation during COVID, and there was just no records to back it up. So I ended up, putting together a findings letter and saying this is what the overpayment was, and it was a couple $100,000. And then I hear back from their attorney, and it's like, how could this be? They have all these records, and I show them exactly what I have with the attestation, and there was records emailed to us that we just never got. And of course, at first I'm like, well, that doesn't sound legit. You attested that everything we had, and I even in the attestation it said records received on whatever day, January 1st, is all that I have. But then they were able to come up with emails that showed that they emailed them to us, and we just didn't get them, and we couldn't find out where it was, a firewall thing or something like that. But they attested to that was all they had, but there was more than what we actually were viewing. So it can kind of work both ways. 90% of the time, it's going to put them on notice that they can't generate more records, and they're saying that you're going to do your review based on what we provided you today.
Right. And that's an important piece, because there are instances where a provider where a provider signs that attestation. And yeah, I mean, in cyberspace, things get lost, right? And things, whatever the situation winds up being, firewall or otherwise. I mean, oftentimes you send something and you don't get a notification that it didn't get there, or you get a notification weeks later. So the attestation does work both ways. For me, I look at the attestation as a way in during an appeal. When a provider makes an appeal, outside of a provider appealing the findings, like right now we're working on an appeal for one of our clients where there were a number of denials, and the provider is arguing the denial not based upon new documents, but in their mind, a different interpretation of our auditor's findings, right? And that's different versus instances in which an appeal comes in and the provider is producing miraculously found or identified or discovered or located documents that didn't exist. And we've talked about this before, and I don't want to spend too much time from the UPIC perspective, but we've talked about it before, how when a provider has a denial and an overpayment letter goes out from the MAC and there's an appeal, how the UPIC, the documents that the UPIC used to create the overpayment analysis and those denials, those documents are, for lack of a better term, static. Whenever there's an appeal that goes through on the redeterminations, reconsiderations, ALJ, or what have you, those documents are static. They never get to change. No new documents can be produced by the government for that. But the provider is entitled to provide any other documents to support their rationale. And so when you have an attestation where the provider says, I've produced everything, and then there's an appeal and there's new documents, the question becomes, how did this document become a new document when you've already attested to the fact? It's kind of like a double conversation. But for our purposes, it may not be here or there, but it's certainly got some value when you're on the SIU side to be able to argue, well, hold on a minute. You said that you produced everything. Here's an attestation form that supports that. Now, all of a sudden, you have these new documents. So, the thing that we always recommend to our SIU clients is to produce as part of your request, an attestation form where the provider is signing off, to the best of their abilities. And we have a variety of different ways that language is produced in those documents, where we've reduced it to writing for that, because it is an important piece of the puzzle. And plans that are not using an attestation are sort of creating additional work for themselves. When it comes to an appeal, that becomes a very strong document. So, in that same vein, because now we're talking about policies and procedures, Jaysen, I want to go to you, because an important piece of a policy or procedure on medical record reviews is the selection of the records, whether it be probes, statistical, whether it be targeted. And you've been involved with one of our clients in producing some policies and procedures along with our statistician, who, by the way, our statistician is a former CMS statistician. He understands the PIM, and so he's been able to help work with you in shaping a policy and procedure that mirrors the CMS PIM. Now, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, the PIM is the law of the land when it comes to these things. And we're seeing some case law out there regarding things like the inclusion of zero paid claims and things of that sort. And now the most important piece is our what they call net overpayments. But also we've been seeing a lot of cases recently where there have been issues involving the inability of the UPICs to reproduce the documents that help with being able to recreate the science behind statistical sampling, which is a requirement. But getting down to the brass tacks of it is that SIUs and plans should have policies and procedures. If you don't want to reinvent if you feel like you need to reinvent the wheel, you come up with your own. But if you don't, you can certainly look at what the CMS PIM says with regard to this, and whether or not you're using statistical sampling or probe sampling or what have you. And some of that these are important pieces of an SIU's function.
So the two concepts that you have to keep in mind when developing a process and then ultimately a procedure is you want to decide what outcomes you're looking for, and then you want them to be both supportable and defensible. And while they're closely related, they are two separate things, because you may be able to support what it is that was done, but it may not be defensible. So back to your point about, is it consistent with the PIM? Is it consistent with whatever oversight requirements there might be? Different states have different requirements. Some states don't allow for extrapolation. Some states have very specific methodologies in terms of conducting uh, uh, statistically valid random samples. So you need to identify what those requirements are and build them into the processes of which you've decided are consistent with the best interest of the organization. Now, having said that, I am sure that there are, a number of things that you can decide to do as an organization. That doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean that it's going to be sustainable. Now, in terms of attestations, it's a little bit random. Totally agree. Attestations are really should be a required tool. However, it also comes down to that at the end of the day, if a provider ends up digging out the exonerating information, it's going to be exonerating information, whether or not they signed an attestation that they've handed everything over. Anything could happen. It could be missing. It could be, whatever other reason it wasn't made available in the early stages of it. One technique that I highly recommend, frankly, especially when it's not a law enforcement referral or a law enforcement initiative, is that you consider a provider looking at the findings and seeing what it is that went into those findings, because it will give them that opportunity to say, well, wait a minute. You're not getting this piece of information that's really important. And because at the end of the day, if you pour all that effort into a finding that at some point gets overturned at an appeal, a reconsideration, whatever other due process procedure that might be in place, what price glory at that point?
Right. And obviously in the UPIC world, when we're talking about government related stuff, because at some point, if there are appeals and things of that sort, there become a lot of hands that get in there, right? A lot of cooks in the kitchen. And we've seen instances where the UPIC does its overpayment, it sends it to the MAC doesn't calculate it properly, there's an error in that, claims get overturned, there's this, there's that, there's the other, a lot of hands that get involved. But when we're talking about the commercial or an MCO, the SIU space, it's really self-contained, right? Appeals are done in-house. As part of your in-network agreement, there's the process, provider dispute resolution or alternate dispute resolution or whatever they want to call it. So you get a little bit less, of that back and forth. But you got to have a policy that lays out all of these things, even as simple as how you're going to maintain the books and records on the methodology and the sampling to be able to give it back to the provider when they want to appeal it, right? Every provider is entitled to appeal the denials, and how they choose to go about doing that denial appeal. It could be because they've gone through the records and they've said, well, wait a minute, the auditor denied this claim for this reason, but we just looked through the records and we found this. The auditor missed it, right? The problem with doing these is that they are human, and so there's the prospect of there being an error in there. And so it is important that there be a policy and a procedure in place for both the auditing piece from the appeals perspective, but you've got to have good policies in place for consistency in your sampling, right? Because the one thing that you don't want, and this becomes an ROI piece of the puzzle, is the more that you have providers appealing denials, the more it's going to cost the plan, and that ROI starts to be diminished. And then part of that then becomes also that you've put in all this time, effort, and energy to something that ultimately results in a bunch of appeals. And so from at least the litigation perspective, Jaysen, I'm thinking in terms of that when you're doing, like, for example, a probe sample, right? A statistical sample, you're not selecting the records. You're not picking what the number of records is, right? Our statistician or the plan statistician is doing that. But at least in a probe sample situation where there's, where the PIM says 20 to 40, my perspective is, why should it be 20? Why should it be 40? Why should it be some number in between? That there's a lack of consistency. If Wade pulls 20 records and I pull 40 records, what you don't want is some lawyer coming in and arguing, you have a lack of consistency. Why did you pick 20? Why did you pick 40? And that's why I always say when we have conversations with our plans, pick 30. It's the number in the middle of the PIM. And if you have every one of your investigators on a probe sample, not a targeted sample, because targeted is particular records, but on a probe sample, you create a level of consistency that closes the door for an argument. Now, if someone ever wanted to argue with you, why'd you pick 30? You could say, well, it's the number between 20 and 40, and it's a number that we've kept, from a consistency perspective. So it's something to consider. So Matt, I want to go to you for this last piece, because this becomes kind of the biggest piece of the discussion, which is that, right, some states in the Medicaid space, right, some states do not allow for statistical sampling and extrapolation. And so that presents a whole other set of problems, because in the world of statistical sampling and overpayment extrapolation, the minimum number of records that is required typically when you use rat stats is 100. And so you've got states that say you can't do statistical sampling, you can't do extrapolation, it's actuals only, which then leads to a whole other set of issues. Everything from provider abrasion, requesting a larger number of records to be able to get an actual number. And that actual number may still not be as high as what an extrapolated number is. Managing that, staffing, all of that, and then the delays. So, and you're dealing with it now, both with our internal team and some of our SIU overflow work. You're experiencing all of this.
Absolutely. And I wanted to go back to some of the points that Wade and Jaysen made in terms of appeals and the attestations. I think it even goes beyond policies and procedures and being consistent. It's in the decision making on what the sample should be, what the frame should be. Because what I've seen are a lot of appeals where it's on, therapy sessions, whether they be physical therapy, psychiatric therapy, where the findings are related to where's the treatment plan? How is this part of the continuum of care? How is the patient getting better? It's not demonstrated in the record that I'm seeing, but the sample that was asked for is random. Patient A, this service, patient B over here, patient C, go back to patient A 2 years later, this service. And it's impossible for the provider to provide an essence of the continuum of care for that patient if we're randomly selecting, visit A from 2021, visit B from 2023, or whatever. It's impossible for the provider unless they get appealed, and then they say, oh, wait a minute, you want to see the treatment plan, you want to see the continuum of care, here's 3 years of records. Take a look at this and show me where this patient hasn't gotten better from 21 to 23 with all of the care that's been given them. And that's the problem we're seeing from how we're choosing our samples. If we're doing therapy and we're looking for patient benefit of care, you got to change the sample from individual random claims to perhaps, I want the whole record for this patient for this time frame, and do that as the sample. And I think that would get rid of a lot of the attestation problems and saying, well, you didn't ask for everything because you were looking at findings for things you never asked for, and also get rid of a lot of the appeals because we can show at the beginning, this person was seen for 3 years. They didn't do crap, the whole time, or the patient got better and this is legitimate. So I think that gets rid of a lot of those problems. The abrasion stuff and the extrapolation, that is a huge issue for SIUs right now in those states, because for them to have an ROI, you've got to increase the samples to 100 or 200 claims, and that causes the providers to go berserk. As soon as you send in that request, you're getting the call saying, we can't provide this in this amount of time. This is going to cost us resources. Oh, and here's the bill for the copying. To when it comes time when we get the records, do we have the medical review staff on hand to be able to look at 200 claims, that are so, again, going back to my original thing, so disparate in here's a claim here, a claim there, a claim there, and try to make sense of all of that, to at the end, when you submit the the overpayment, there's going to be a huge appeal of that based on the onerousness of the request, and saying, oh yeah, I got you the 200 records as quickly as I could, but here's the rest of the stuff that attestation or not, you asked for so much, I couldn't get it to you all. Here's more, whether they generated right then or not, or whether it was in archived files, whatever it may be. You're going to even get more records back on the appeal, causing those problems to proliferate. And it's just very, very difficult to manage those types of resources and issues to where you can get a decent ROI out of these types of claim by claim medical reviews.
So let's talk a little bit more. We're kind of getting ready to run out of time, but I do think an important point to close out on is that when you're making these requests, even if it's on a statistical probe, targeted, whatever it is, I think where sometimes SIU investigators get a little befuddled with themselves and trying to figure it out is, do you make these requests based upon a date of service, or do you make these requests based upon the totality of the patient file? And the example I give is that first of all, you have to look at each one of these as individual cases. I think that, for me, if you're talking about evaluation and management, right, one of the things that people always want to talk about is the impossible day. We were just talking about this before we started to record this, is the impossible day scenario in E&Ms is not the same today as it was before the 2021 guidelines, right? The 2021 guidelines removed time as the prevailing factor, and medical decision-making is the driving factor. So is it possible for a provider who's seen 50 people in a day to have an impossible day, yet still be able to document all 50 of those patients, versus, for example, physical therapy or behavioral health, where there may be the need to look at the totality of the record? So as we wrap up on time, talk a little bit about sort of those nuanced differences, and from an investigator's perspective, having to really put on that thinking cap to determine how are you going to do your sampling.
Yeah. This is going back to that decision making. You have to know what your allegation is and what you're trying to find. If it's a type of service that it's a one-time, it's got to stand on its own. I either did this E&M at the level that I billed it, or I didn't. That's where you can do claim by claim, pulling random ones. But when it's a chiropractic care, acupuncture care, physical therapy, behavioral health, where you're seeing the patient over a period of time with set goals at the beginning and interim steps along the way as the patient's being treated, to just cherry pick individual services throughout that time isn't really going to give the auditor the complete picture that they need to make an informed decision on these claims are supported by the documentation, because those claims, those individual services, really don't stand on their own because they're part of a series. And so you've got to make your sample in line with that. And it'll make all the difference in the world in terms of the results.
Right. So, for me, the important takeaway of this, to an extent, is that when you're thinking about how you're your record. So you've already made the determination you want to do a probe sample, or you've made the determination you're doing a statistically valid random sample, right? Because targeted samples are different. Targeted samples are, we want these particular records for these particular patients. But the important piece kind of globally is, are you looking at a one-off type of scheme? Are you looking at an ongoing concern that you've got? When you're talking about therapy, for example, that's a continuum of care. So, you want to maybe look at 360 degrees of the patient's file. But if you're doing something like an E&M or a one-off service, do you really need, to do you really need to look at the entirety of the patient's record? Now, I will say that when we are doing an investigation in which it is a one-off procedure or service or item, your request should be for the records supporting that item, service, or procedure on that date of record and any other records in the file that support it. Because, for example, a provider might do an item, service, or procedure in the office, and the documentation itself may not have anything to support the medical necessity for that item, service, or procedure because they went in for that procedure. But there might be an E&M visit from 2 weeks beforehand where the provider, the E&M results in them having that item, service, or procedure. So when you're formulating your request, you've got to be very clear, particularly if it's for a particular date of service. It might be to provide the records on this for this particular date of service for this item, service, or procedure, and any other records that support the decision making to get there. So, it's not a mechanical process that you've got to go through. There's a little bit more of that thinking process. So
when doing
challenge.
that, keep in mind that you're asking for 100 of those records or 200 of those records. They've got 30 days to respond. Is the provider going to take the time, or their billing clerk or whoever is pulling these records going to take the time to say, oh, the decision on this one was made 2 weeks ago, I'm going to pull that too? Or is that going to be going to the appeal saying, oh, here's the other records that support it?
Right.
And that's
right.
where all of this comes full circle.
Right. So it really, I think that, the big takeaway, this isn't a mechanical process. And when you're looking to get, when you're looking to do, and particularly the case when you're looking to do a statistical sample of records, it is really important, even if you've got the ability to run the statistical sample yourself using RATstats. And look, we use it here for our SIU. It's really important that you have the consult and have the ability to have a consultation with a statistician about whether or not the sample that you're pulling is going to withstand statistical scrutiny. Statistics is a science, and one of the biggest things about making it a science is the ability to replicate the methodology. And so it is important that when you are looking across that billing history that you've got, that you consult with your statistician about instances where there might be some nuances to pulling that sample. For example, and we don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but are you looking to do things like, does it need to be stratified? Meaning, does it need to be broken up into segments because you've got divergent pieces of information? Is it a 5-year period of time in which there are 30 codes involved? That may lead to stratifying the sampling or something like that. Is it such a large volume of records that a 100 record sample may not really get you what you need? So the important piece, and this really is something that's part of a policy and procedure, is the ability to consult with a statistician with expertise in healthcare related matters. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to run a statistical sample that meets the requirements of, for example, the PIM, but yet it's flawed in some other scientific way. And so having a statistician to be able to call upon and give them the facts of your case from that high level will help to ensure that you've got a strong sample with a strong extrapolation that's defensible, right? Because the one thing that I will tell you, when you go to defend one of these, you attack the methodology first. And if the methodology is sound, then you attack the results of the sampling, which is the audit itself. So you want to be able to make sure that your methodology is strong, that your sampling is strong, and that you're backed by the science of statistics. So a lot of stuff to unpack, a lot of information that comes out of these medical record reviews. Hopefully we gave everybody here a little bit of a purview into what that should look like and how that all works. So as always, your insight is always super appreciated. Matt, Jaysen, and Wade,